If I took a circle and just gave it a fill of a particular color or shade, in this case it's a shade, it's a value, it doesn't look any more dimensional than a quarter sitting on a piece of paper or a hole cut in this paper. There's nothing to say it jumps off. It doesn't have dimension to it. So if you were to look at this circle and start thinking, what would happen if I gave it a light source? If you have a light source that's strong, you have to imagine the darkest part of this round object being right here, and it's known as a core shadow area. Okay? The light will not be able to hit this area. And as this area gets a little towards the edge, it starts picking up a little bit of what's known as reflected light. So what I'd suggest and hope you do is set up some objects and take a look and see if this really happens, that in sunlight, the darkest dark on an object is somewhere around here at its core shadow. I've slightly rotated the light source, and you'll understand in a second why I did that, so that it has a little bit of dimension. The area of this ball, think of it in your mind as being blue, pink, red, green. It doesn't matter what value or color we put here, but it should be getting more of that intensity towards the shadow, so that if it was green, for example, it would be lighter here and getting darker green till it joins this shadow area and almost obscures right at this edge. What you'll then have is an area that's going to be highlighted, and it's over here. And a lot of artists are afraid to do what's known as burn out a highlight or take an edge out. And they will have an outline all the way around the object, but the minute you take that off and soften some of these other areas, it just allows the eye to fill in that edge and create a little bit more believability. This outline, for example, is too dark for what I had intended the color to be. So I'm just going to put a softer outline or edge there. And now just blending with my finger, it doesn't have to be a finger. Obviously, I could spend more time drawing with pencil on top of pencil, but do you see how we're starting to get a little bit more roundness in this object? And if I took a darker pencil, I could build this value up even more and create a little bit of roundness, hopefully implying that there's form to this now. The next thing I wanted to concentrate on is the shadow that this object would cast. If we want to anchor it to the ground, then a shadow is going to be apparent. And the light source from the sun travels in parallel lines, and it will miss this ball or sphere or whatever and end up casting its longest point parallel to where that line would end up. If you look at this example of a pencil held up in the sunlight, what you'll notice is that right to the edge of the pencil, it's pretty crisp all the way along. If I show you a picture taken in indoor lighting conditions with an incandescent light, you'll notice that the shadow nearest the pencil is very dark and strong, but it starts immediately fading out and becoming less obvious the further away it is from the pencil. The intensity of the light source in the daylight will be a lot stronger. The darkest shadow is usually here, and next to the object, it'll start fading away. If you want to make the viewer of your art move to a certain part of your drawing, then the idea is to use something as simple as a gradation to move the viewer's eye to where you want them to look. In this case, I'm trying to have them look at this sphere, so I want to take and darken some areas, but I want this area here to have some gradation in it. I don't want to do what the sunlight has, even though I know in the sunlight this edge is crisp and dark pretty much through this whole shape. I'm going to leave it darker towards the object to lift it off and tone it out as I go further away. Whether I soften the edge or not is a choice you'll make as an artist. If I take the cone as the next shape that I want to show you, same thing applies. The darkest dark is going to be here. And I'm deliberately doing something wrong so I can correct myself. Okay? When I'm drawing, I should be drawing in this direction to create the roundness of it. But sometimes there's too many things to think about, and you want to take care of committing the one thing you don't want to forget first, which is in this case the darkest darks. So I'm putting in some shading in this direction just to remind myself that that's the gradation I want, and later I can do it with a finger, I can do it with a blending stump, but I can do the shading I want at a later time in the direction I want. But it's an important part of this process to start thinking that you're drawing in the roundness or the contour of the actual object. If you'll notice how I'm holding the pencil, it's not magic, but it allows me to do some smudging and cleaning off using the side of the pencil or the edge of the pencil basically. What I've found is that if you hold a pencil like I'm doing right now, to create that arc, I'm limited. I have to lift my hand to do something. But if I took my fingers and held the pencil like this, I could do a lot larger arc without, it's not pretty maybe, but I've got more control over the amount of space I can travel with that pencil. So I can hold it like this between the two fingers. Think of smoking a cigarette, only I hope you don't smoke. And if you could try different things, don't get into a habit. You've always drawn this way, so that's the way it has to be. No, give that up. The shadow of this previous object could now come in and tie into that second shape that I've drawn, and we've created a little bit more volume or dimension to this painting. Now that I've got cast shadows from the object, the core shadow of the object, and a shadow that it's left on this new object. It's side by side. And having that variation where it got gradated here, getting a little lighter, allows this shadow here to stay a little bit varied so the two don't meld into each other and get lost, right? Okay, if I was a little exaggerating on the darks, I could take an eraser and pull out some of these highlights. And it's not going to make the artwork any less believable if I don't have an outline in it. I've mentioned that a lot of people draw from different sources, three-dimensional, two-dimensional, and one-dimensional, and I'm calling it imagination for one-dimensional. A lot of the artists that are strong in the one-dimensional aspect have a problem with too much outline. They're cartoonists. They're used to drawing things with edges on them, and they make a pretty picture and whatever, but they don't fill it with any of these values. So I'm trying to get you familiar with how to do something as simple as putting volume to previously just outlines. If I take this next shadow and think about it the same way I did with the first one, it should be darker next to the object, and as it gets further away, it will lighten up. So anticipating that, I'll just do a little bit of shading there and darkening it here. If I took that square and thought about that square as being something that I want to give volume to it, think of it being a cube. Cube then has 4 sides. We'll see only 3 of them in this example. But what I can do with the cube is remind you that this outline is not serving any purpose on a white surface. It's a dark line lifting off of a white surface. So I want to tone this area down immediately, take off some of those edges, and put some darks where I want the surface to pop out on. Okay, I want it to lift off of the surface. This whole side, if I filled it with one solid color, would be boring. There'd be no reason for a viewer to look at it any one corner any differently than the other. So what I'm going to deliberately do is do a gradation. A more dramatic gradation is this horizontal or diagonal one, and as opposed to the horizontal or vertical. There's more energy in this, so that's what I've chosen to do. And if you look at some of the reference, this reference here is from inside. Under a desk lamp, you see the gradation happening off of here, getting darker here. These are some other examples where the gradation starts here and gets a little darker at the top. The way it happens depends on the source of light, the reflected light bouncing around it. But even in this example, you can see how it's lighter in the corner, darker up here. Everything I'm doing here can be tested at home. At this point, I've tried to tell you about gradations, and I want to take off some of those back lines too and give this top a little bit of variation in it. We will talk about it later, but I'm going to tell it to you now so you're anticipating it. Every plane, which means a surface, has to be lit differently in nature. There's no way this top plane, call it A, is going to be lit the same way as B or C. If the sun's coming from here, they have to have some difference to them. So toning it a little bit differently is already something I want you to put into your minds to remember that there's a reason for doing it. And a lot of times it's to either keep it from lifting off of the background, or here to give the viewer some reason to look through this plane. Even if you've captured their attention only in this area, I want them to have a reason to look from one corner or another. And if you think about that as you're doing even your shadows, that's the next important thing. Because as an artist, it's got to be the most flattering thing to have people stand and look at something you've created out of nothing. Remember, we're talking a simple pencil that is able to get people to stop and look at you and wonder how you managed to make that happen on a piece of paper. Okay? So a gradation is all I'm talking about here, softening it off to the edge. Up to this point, these edges have been pretty hard, and that's the lighting conditions I'm mostly aware of or using myself. But you have to look at where your reference gathering's taking place. If you're drawing flowers in a vase in indoor lighting conditions, remember your shadows are going to be softer. If you're doing things out in the sunlight, that's how your shadows could be. But if you're an artist, not a photocopier, not taking everything so literally, you might say, I'm going to soften my edges when I don't want people to pay attention and harden them where I really want people to look. You use whatever you need to move the viewer to wherever you want them to look. I know you've seen this in countless children's books, how to draw, but it is the most foundational part of art. And if you could start taking some of this and applying it to your art, you're going to be one step closer to making art that is something that people look at and go, wow. Okay? That art you think is so good is because that artist knew how to do this. When I think back to all the times that I've done this example here, the one thing that stops a lot of people is where this core shadow is. So a lot of times the shadow they end up with means it's hard-edged all the way along the back, the darkest dark being right along here. And it's my intention to at least point out that that doesn't always have to happen. It can happen. You can orchestrate your light source so that it does happen by putting nothing to reflect the light back off of it into the object here. But concentrate on where that core shadow is. So that's of prime importance because it allows you to have a light and a light at the edge of each object, and that doesn't lift off of a background the way it would if you had a dark edge here. I'm fond of telling people about light sources, so if I drew a glass like this, and I put hard edges all the way around it, and took a second glass, and just put hard edges along the sides where I wanted you to think there's not as much light coming from. Which one has a light source to it? That's what I want you to look at, that sharpness of that outline. If I then threw some shadows here, you'd be able to understand that there's a light source coming from this direction, and maybe a shadow under here would do the same. So you don't need those hard edges, and that would be the second thing I'd really want to point out. To soften edges is an important part of this exercise, and the shadow treatment itself is the gradation. Okay, so don't have everything solid black all the way along. Have it gradate out so that the viewer's eye is moved towards the object, and that should help you convey a little bit more volume than you're used to seeing in beginning art. What I'd suggest you do at home is find some objects that are going to aid in this process. I've drawn it for you, but I want you to actually be able to handle them, to put them in different light sources and situations. And in this case, I've grabbed a cone, a sphere, a cylinder, and some blocks of wood. Okay? You don't have to know anybody who's a carpenter, but it helps to, keep your fingers if you get somebody else to do it. What I also did, and this is man-made almost, most of it is I took a piece of cardboard and made a rectangle. Inside that rectangle, I put some shapes. A cylinder cut out of a piece of paper, stretched around with an end on it and no end on this side. A ball that I got at, I don't even know, a Christmas ornament store, who knows what it is. A cube I made out of cardboard. Cut a hole in it just to hold that. And now I've got some props that I can look at and actually see what the light source is doing in different situations.